Hi, let me ask you a question. Do you have the COVID blues? What I mean by that is, when we first learned of COVID, when it first came out in March, and yeah, there was a lot of fear and there was a lot of anxiety and there was a lot of this new thing and nobody tended to know what it was, a lot of misinformation. But there were a lot of great things that came out of that as well. Yay, we get to work at home in our pajamas. Or now I'm going to have the time to really binge watch the shows that I haven't been able to on Netflix. In fact, I think Tiger King was such an incredible success because of COVID. There were virtual concerts on TV. Do you remember that when it first started? It's like celebrities, musicians got together and they said, all right, we're going to all work together. We're going to entertain you even though we can't come to your town. So we're going to get on Zoom, each one of us in a different place, and we're going to play together. We're going to have this virtual concert. You don't see that anymore, do you? Celebrities would go on Twitter, go on Facebook, and they would give messages. They're still trying to be entertainers, but they're trying to do it virtually, and I haven't seen that in a long time. Are you getting nostalgic? Man, I remember when we could go to church and didn't have to wear a mask. I remember when we could pass communion, when we could sit together. The good old days. Have you been gnawed by those feelings? Man, I would just love to have a get-together with a bunch of my friends. And all I can see on the news, they're warning about don't do that, and the people who are violating that and all that. I would love to just have a bunch of people over for a party on the back deck, but can't do it. This COVID thing's just covering our news. And life was really tough before. But now it's like this whole pall has just descended, not only our culture, but the world. A big cloud. And it just wears on and wears on and wears on. In dark times like these, when we have the COVID blues, I think it's very important. No, not just very important. I think it's essential. It may be a matter of spiritual life and death that we focus on faith. And doesn't faith boil down to trusting God's promises? That when He promises something, it's going to happen. Not that we're going to get the results now, because that's not how faith works. So we have to take a step of faith. There's an interval, and it could be a minute, it could be a week, it could be a year, it could be a lifetime, like in the promise of salvation, the promise of the resurrection and all that. We're not going to see that in this life. And the time in between the receiving of the promise and the delivery on the promise, or the fulfillment of the promise, that whole gap is where faith is. And it's where the promise keeps us hopeful. The promise keeps us going because we have an assurance in the promise based on our assurance in God. But when we are surrounded by circumstances that demand our attention, we tend to take our focus and place it on where the alarms are going off. COVID and the election and all the stuff that's going on that perpetually goes on is demanding our attention. You can't get away from it on the news. You can't get away from it in discussions. We're reminded of it. I'm reminded of it constantly every day. Folks will drop by the building and they'll have a mask, or we'll social distance. Folks have come by for counseling and we social distance. And there's a reminder constantly, even by the ways that everything that we do when we go to the grocery store, there's a constant reminder, and you can't get away from it. Alarms are going off all the time. And guys, I think that's when it's paramount to our spiritual development and security that we take our eyes off that and put them on the promises of God. A story of a boy in a burning building on the third floor. He's on the balcony of like an apartment building or a home, and he's third floor, smoke billowing around him, can't see anything beyond just the railing that's in front of him, fire behind him. And he hears a voice down from below, and he can't see who it is, but he knows by the voice that it's his father. And his father says, "Son, jump, and I will catch you." The boy can't see the father. He doesn't know if the father can see the balcony. Does he jump? The father promised to catch him, Now, if you'd ask him any time other than that, give the boy the scenario. If you believe in that scenario, if you jump, do you believe your dad would catch you? Absolutely. My dad can do everything. But now he's in the situation. And that's kind of the difference between philosophical belief and putting your life on the line, which is what faith is. But what happens to you and me is we go through a process of trying to make the promise into something we can see. So the boy has time. Now, if he stands there long enough, he's going to jump, and he's going to jump just out of desperation, because 9/11, we saw people jump out of the towers, and they knew there was no way they were going to live, but they'd rather die by impact than to be burned to death. So we're not talking about jumping out of desperation. We're not talking about a leap of blind faith. And a leap of blind faith, and I think that's an oxymoron. I don't think faith is ever blind. It's always based on evidence. Scripture teaches that. But if the boy came out and the fires is closing around, and he jumped hoping that his dad would be down there, although he hadn't heard his voice or whatever, that's a blind leap. That's not what we do. That's not the God that we serve, and that's not the promises that we have. So, is he going to catch me? Can he see me? What if dad misses? You see, we try to control the outcome. We try to convince ourselves that it's impossible for this to go wrong before we'll jump. Guys, what I want you to understand is, when God demonstrates his fulfillment of promises, it's when things have gone wrong. It's when things are impossible. It's when Sarah was way beyond childbearing age. And God had promised Abraham, you're going to have more kids than you could ever count. He didn't live to see it, but he believed it. It's the trustworthiness of the promiser that makes it not a leap in the dark. Now, if the son told himself, well, Dad probably pulled a trampoline up around here. Our dad has one of those big nets like the firemen use, so it's safe for me to jump. See, what he did is he used his logic. What he did was he controlled the situation in his mind, so he doesn't have any faith in his dad at all. Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Have you been rejoicing today? Did you rejoice yesterday? If not, I want to suggest to you that your focus got pulled away from what God wants you to focus on to what our world is shouting at us to focus on. Let your forbearing, patient spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So we say, God, please protect us and our family and our loved ones from COVID. And then we let it go and let him do his thing. Now, what we're really saying is not, please protect me from COVID, in terms of that I can't catch it and the possibility of dying. Please protect me from focusing on all of that and focusing on the promises that you've given me. Please, Father, protect me from COVID causing me to lose my soul because I begin to distrust you. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute. If there's anything that is excellent, anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on these things. The things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So, cast all your cares on him and then focus on the right stuff. Your anxiety level is just as high as your focus is on all the alarms going off around us. Your peace or your anxiety is low based upon listening to things that are true and honorable and pure and all of those kinds of things. And guys, we know where that comes from. 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul, who was feeling quarantined, he was feeling isolated. Have you been feeling that? He wrote to Timothy, when you come, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 13, when you come, bring the cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus, the books, especially the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. At my first defense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me, strengthened me, in order that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was delivered out of the lion's mouth. And the Lord will deliver me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Those are some of the last verses that Paul ever wrote. 2 Timothy chapter 4 is the last chapter of the last book he ever wrote. And it is more personal, has more pathos in it than anything he wrote. I want you to see his feeling of isolation. I want you to see his feeling of quarantine. And he's pleading with his son in the faith, Timothy, when you come, bring my cloak. He probably needed that because it's cold in prisons. Bring me that so I can stave off the cold. But my books and my parchments. I think what he wanted was, and I think personally what I think those represent is his writings and his scriptures. You see, everybody's abandoning him, and he makes that point, and there's a little bit of a barb in that. They deserted me. There was no one at my defense. No one supported me. They all deserted me. He didn't say they couldn't make it or things like that. They deserted me. He felt abandoned. And then he added, may it not be held against them. But the Lord stood with me. Guys, what he wanted was a coat, maybe to use as a blanket, but a cloak to use probably to stave off the cold or the elements. And his writings and his scripture. Because that's what gets us through quarantine. That's what gets us through isolation. And he wanted to go back to those promises. Guys, we all need to be reminded of the promises of God. We all need to be, because we all have our faith tested. And our hope comes from those promises. And when we take our eyes off the promises, we begin to lose hope, or our hope begins to wane. Deuteronomy chapter 31. Moses is talking to Israel. He is about to die. He is telling them, I'm not going to be able to go across the Jordan. And then in the presence of Israel, he talks to Joshua. So Moses went and spoke all these words to Israel, and he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I am no longer able to come and go. And the Lord said to me, you shall not cross this Jordan. It is the Lord your God who will cross ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua is the one who will cross ahead of you, just as the Lord has spoken. And the Lord will do to them just as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and to their land when he destroyed them. And the Lord will deliver them up before you. You shall do to them according to all the commandments which I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or tremble at them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not forsake you or leave you. When Moses called to Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall give it to them as an inheritance. And the Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. 3 times God said either don't fear or be courageous. Why? Guys, this is a tough transition. And that's the promise that we're going to start with in looking at this new study on being fearless and standing on the promises. This first promise, it's actually 4 promises in one, is the basis for our being fearless, because that's exactly what the context. Be courageous. Don't be afraid. And here's why. I'm going to give you a promise. Now, you're not going to realize it today. You're not going to see it fulfilled today. but I'm giving it to you today, and I want you to believe it. Guys, when we're in exile, it kind of feels that way, doesn't it? We're kind of isolated. There are more times that we feel alone in the wilderness. And here they are in the same situation. They've been exiled for 40 years. The only leader they have ever known, the guy that brought them out of Egypt, is now leaving. And he's telling them Joshua is going to be their new leader. And he's telling Joshua in their presence, don't be afraid. Does that suggest that the people think he might be afraid? Does that suggest that he's afraid? You see, there's a lot of uncertainty there. So they got to fight all these people, including the Nephilim, without Moses, with this guy that, yeah, he's great and we love him, but he's not Moses. Guys, the Red Sea was for this. God parted the Red Sea to show them. And he's going to show them in Jericho and keep showing them that what's impossible, I do, if you will believe in it and believe in me. You know, I've heard it said a lot of different ways, and probably you have too. The myth of the concept of far away. We're not going to be able to look at this whole promise in this session, but we are going to look at it because this is one of the most fundamental promises. It's made up of 4 parts. The myth of far away. And I've heard it said, if you feel distant from God, who left? Now, it's a pithy question, but it's an impossibility. Because if you feel distant from God, your feelings are wrong. And the problem is you're trusting your feelings rather than trusting in his promises. You can't be distant from God. God can't be distant from you. That's the promise that he's given to us. Have you ever felt like when you pray, your prayers just bounce off the ceiling? Have you ever felt that way? That's when you got to cling to the promise and shake yourself. That's when the mind has to take the heart by the throat and say, you're not leading us. I'm going to be led by my feelings. I'm going to be led by the promises of God, and I'm going to believe them until I feel them. 4 parts. He goes ahead of you. He goes with you. He will never fail you. He will never forsake you. I think one of the chilliest concepts to me is that there were folks on the Titanic when it sank. The Titanic is over 2 miles below the surface. The pressure on it is 25,000 pounds per square inch because of the depth. We can't go down there except with very, very specifically designed machines because the pressure is so great. It took over 2 hours for the ship to sink, but it took 10 minutes. Once the whole thing cleared the surface, it took 10 minutes to make it to the bottom. How cold and quiet and alone. So far away. There were people trapped on that ship who knew they were going to die. Either the water would finally get to them, the pressure would crush them, or they'd run out of air. What a lonely grave. Do you understand that God was already there at the bottom, 2+ miles down, to receive them? You see, the concept of omnipresence, that God is everywhere, is a great philosophical, we even give it a philosophical name. Omnipresence, omnipotent, omniscient. Those are big, highfalutin words, and they're accurate, but they tend to be philosophical notions. What God said is, I'm going to go on before you, and then I'm going to go with you. That's really what that word means. I've gone everywhere in the universe before you, and I'm with you every step of the way. I'm going to lead you wherever you're going, and I'm going to meet you when you get there, and I've already been there, and I've prepared everything. He escorts you there, and he meets you there. What if we really believe this? What if we really believed when we feel alone? What if we really believed? What if there was only one person left on the Titanic, and they were headed down to that watery grave by themselves? How lonely that seemed. How isolated. 2 miles down. I mean, it took almost 100 years before we could even send somebody down there. And by then they were long gone. What if we really believed that God is already where we're going to go? And he's going to lead us there. Several years ago, when I was in graduate school at OC, I wrote a poem. I was in a class with Dr. Jones on the Old Testament, and he could really bring that to life. And we were going through passages that just passages like this about the presence of God. This is called The Search by Steve Parker. Climb to the scraggly peak of the highest mountain, where the air's scarce, and neither flower nor beast can survive. He will be found seated at the crest of the morning. Follow the cave that leads into the very bowels of the earth, where daylight has never entered and whose creatures stare with dead eyes. And in the stone will be carved the message of his wonder. Take to the skies on the wings of the falcon. Fly to the end of the wind and listen ever so quietly to the name it is blown. It is his name, for he blows the wind. Walk the despondent depth of the ocean that none can fathom, where all is still and lifeless as death itself, and know that the bottom of the world is his playground. Slither suspiciously through the woods in the blackness of night, as the eerie sounds and wary movement warn you that you don't belong. He stands behind each tree to protect you on your way. Gaze in amazement at the delicate skin of a flower's petal. Wonder in awe of the beauty that created it. Early this morning, while you slumbered securely in bed, he gently unfolded each flower's leaves to softly remind you that he had prepared the day just for you. Stumble each step along the path of solitude that leads to the cavern of the empty soul, where only loneliness abides. His arms will embrace you there, for he was the first to arrive. Walk alone when all who claim love have forsaken you. Each mountain that oppresses you, you will scale, for he watches each step that you take and lifts you on the eagle's wings when the way turns treacherous. Stand firm when you plant your feet in the right. When the storms of persecution and scoffing slap at your face, his face bears the scars of the ridicule and arrogance of men, and the caress of his hand will soothe forever. Stand by the coffin of the one who's been stripped from your loving arms. Slump for refuge into his massive hands that will bear you with tenderness. Your tears that drop into the hollow of his hand flow into the river of his heart. Long before you, he stood beside the cross of his only son, and death pierced his heart. Wander as a child from the warmth of a mother's embrace, and when you look around and see that you are lost, merely whisper his name from your heart, and the flood of his presence will teach you you are never alone. Lay quietly in peace when it's time for the clouds of death to drift over your bed. Be still as the wings of angels lift you from this life of pain and sorrow. Turn and look as you pass through the threshold from life to life. You will see who has held your hand from the time he first formed it in your mother's womb. Be amazed that you could have ever have been afraid or sorrowful when held by such a powerful and loving hand. Go ahead, ask him if he was always there by your side. Ask him if he was the one that protected you even when you doubted. Don't be afraid. Ask him if he is the one that always loved you and the one who will never stop loving you. He will whisper his answer on the wings of the wind, and the wind will echo his name. I am. Do you believe? Are you a practical atheist? You see, we think in atheism in terms of philosophical atheists. But there are practical atheists. There are people who claim him, but don't live like he's really there. Don't live like they believe his promises. We've got a nation full of people who claim him. But when push comes to shove, they don't act like they do. They are practical atheists. They don't believe him. You believe in God, you do well. The demons also believe and tremble. Your actions show not only your belief, but the depth of your belief. Do you believe his promise? I will go before you. I will go with you. Or do you choose and pick what you're going to believe? On this question, do I believe God's with me? Do I believe that no matter where I go, he's there? He's always been there. And he leads me there. On that question, are you a practical atheist? Brothers and sisters, it's great that we believe. It's great that we trust. There's a story of old of a tightrope walker that put a rope across Niagara Falls, and he was going to walk across. He was a showman, and there were crowds on either side. And he would go to one side, and he would talk to them, and this crowd over here, they couldn't hear over the rush of the water, but they would hear the crowd on the other side cheer. Then he would come back, and he would talk to them, and they would cheer. And he was asking them questions. Do you believe I can do this? And with each crossing, he added something, put a blindfold on. Do you believe that I can walk across this blindfolded? Got there with a wheelbarrow. Do you believe that I can walk across this tightrope blindfolded with a wheelbarrow? It was one guy had been standing right at the front. He was one of his biggest fans. And he asked the question, do you believe? And everybody cheered, and this guy's jumping up and down. Yes, I believe. I believe you can walk across a rope across Niagara Falls, blindfolded, pushing a wheelbarrow. I believe. And the man said to him, get in the wheelbarrow. You see, that's when we faint away. I believe it, but I don't have to put my life on the line. And the showman said, get into the wheelbarrow. His number one fan wouldn't do it because he believed, but he didn't believe. Now, guys, we have a promise that's in 4 parts, and we're going to look at the other parts of this in more detail next time. And the reason we're going to use 2 sessions with this, I think this is one of the most fundamental promises that we build so many others onto. God goes ahead of us. God goes with us. There's nowhere we can go that he hasn't already been waiting on us and that he doesn't walk with us. He will never fail you. He will never forsake you. Do you believe that? Now, guys, at times I do. At times I doubt. My response to the question, Steve, are you a philosophical atheist? No. Are you a practical atheist? Practical agnostic? No. Are there times where your faith is the level of an agnostic. Yes. Just this set, four-part promise, if we can believe that, if we will believe that, we have no way to fail. We have nothing to fear. And we should never, ever feel alone. Should never feel separated from God. Well, if you feel distant from God, who left? Nobody did. Because my feelings are lying to me. Brothers and sisters, will you go to that last chapter of Deuteronomy? Would you go to that and refocus on the promises? Would you remind yourself that God said in Deuteronomy 31, verse 8, and the Lord is the one who goes ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not fail you nor forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Do you have fear? Do you have fear of COVID? Do you have fear of the future? Do you have fear of what's going to happen if and when we develop a cure or a vaccine for this disease? Do you fear? Go back to the promise and remind yourself, and remind yourself, and remind yourself. Take your focus off the fears and focus on the promise, because you believe. I know you believe. It's just sometimes we forget to focus on what we believe, and then we begin to fear. And like Peter in the boat, in the storm, when he took his eyes off Jesus, that's when he sank. When he saw all the terror around him and the fear around him, and that's what he focused on, he lost faith in himself. And the faith was never in himself. It's always on the power of Christ to get me to him, even in the midst of a storm. I know you believe, but can you say, as I can say, I believe. Lord, please help my unbelief. I want to believe it more. I want to believe it in such a way that I don't doubt. I want to believe it in such a way that when there's fear all around, I have peace. Because I keep focusing and focusing and focusing on the promises of God. I would like to think, and I would hope this is true, that were I the single passenger left on the Titanic, headed down 2 miles into absolute darkness and cold and pressure, that what would wash over me is not fear. I know I'm going to die, but I have trust in the resurrection. I have hope. But I hope what would wash over me is the knowledge that God is already down there to receive me. I hope that's what would wash over me. I hope that's what would wash over you. Because if you went to that watery grave, not only is he there to receive you, he goes with you the whole trip and watches you and watches over you. And his hands gently take your spirit from your body to glory. And his presence at the bottom receives your body, your flesh, as he who is with you takes your spirit. My hope would be, and I hope that you will remind me, if you're there in the time of my death, God is already where you're going. God is walking with you where you're going. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. Steve, Don't be afraid. If you'll remind me of that, I believe I would smile. And peace would guard my mind and my heart and my soul. That might be the greatest blessing you could give me in the time of my dying, is to remind me of this promise. God bless you this week. Rejoice. Don't be afraid. God is leading you. He's leading me. And he's walking beside you at the same time, and he's walking beside me, and he will never leave. And if you feel distance, don't believe the feelings, because it's impossible for there to be distance. Be at peace. Love. Rejoice. Hope. Because he who promised is faithful. I love you. And the reason I want to remind you of these things is so that we can, in the midst of a world going nuts, find peace. May you have peace this week. God richly bless you. Bye-bye.